Welcome, everyone, to this Encore episode of the Global Missions Podcast. Our team is taking a break from regular production over the summer, but in the meantime, we have a request. If you haven't already, would you take just a few minutes to participate in our 2019 listener survey? We do this once a year, and we would really love to hear your feedback and suggestions about the program. Your input would be very helpful to us, as we're now making decisions about the content plan for the coming year. Of course, we're trying to make sure that it will be really beneficial to you, our listeners, as you share in God's great work of global missions. It's very easy to share in this. Simply visit globalmissionspodcast.com/survey, and we expect it'll take you about 5 minutes to complete it. On behalf of our team, thanks for considering this. We really appreciate your feedback. And now we're glad to re-present one of our most popular episodes. Our guest today is Melissa Chaplin, who is in her second decade of serving cross-cultural workers. You've finished an entire decade already, Melissa.
I have, yes.
Melissa is a professional certified coach, and she serves with the organization Advance Global Coaching. And we were introduced to that organization in a previous season with Sherry Dodd. There's episode 73 on how life coaching can help global workers. Melissa is also an author of a book entitled Returning Well, Your Guide to Thriving Back Home After Serving Cross-Culturally. Melissa, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me. I absolutely love what you guys are doing.
Well, looking forward to this conversation. I'm looking forward to learning together and sharing a bit from the book and other wisdom that would help our listeners love on and support workers, especially as they return back home. So let's begin just by asking this. How did you become interested in this, in helping workers returning from ministry in some other place?
Yeah, well, the Lord's calling on my life to serve among the nations came when I was quite young. And so I went to college wanting to become better prepared to serve cross-culturally. And that just lent itself to being around people who are serving cross-culturally, lent my own cross-cultural experiences. And as I did research and listened to stories, I realized the extent of the challenge in reentry. And my heart just was moved with compassion. Probably the Spirit was moving. And I started doing member care type activities before I even knew it had a name. And so it was in that season that I really felt like the Lord say, I want you to narrow your sights specifically on supporting others who are serving cross-culturally. And obviously that includes those in reentry.
Mm-hmm. When we talk about missions and taking care of our workers, we sometimes think about the preparation phase and helping people get ready to go. I appreciate today we get this opportunity to zoom in on another phase, and that's after they return. Tell us a little about your experience in helping people, the experience you've already had in helping them adjust after returning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for the last 15 years, I've been able to serve both stages, both going and returning. Particularly returning was when I had a lot of different member care hats. And so did field visits, did debriefing with individuals and groups once they actually returned, and then also trained churches as well to be able to receive people back. One organization I have spent several years developing and honing a program to better serve staff when they return to their passport culture. And then a significant role for those 15 years really has been being a professional life coach for cross-cultural workers and walking alongside several of them as they go through that reentry process. So all in all, I've been blessed to walk alongside his people either in or returning from 40 different countries so far.
Wow. Well, we can hear that the Lord has given Melissa some great experience to bring to bear on this conversation. At some point, Melissa, you decided to write it down and put it into a book.
I did.
Why did you choose to do that? What's this about?
Mm-hmm. Well, as I was serving returnees, I noticed a huge gap. And what was happening is so many returnees desired to have an effective debriefing once they came back, once they returned to their passport country. But perhaps they have time limitations, or they didn't have finances, or there were travel restrictions, and they just were not able to obtain that debriefing. And so it was emotionally painful. It was hard to watch them. There's a lot of them just feeling like they were stuck, almost like the word returning reads on the front of the book, Returning Well, of just feeling emotionally banged up or bruised, and just parts of them missing. And so the Lord just really put it on my heart to create a resource that would help them reach the feeling of well on the cover, so alive and restored and strong. and that it be something that they could do right where they were, right when they needed it. And so the guidebook basically packages the aspects of a debriefing that leads to renewal into questions. And so as they go through those questions, they're actively engaging in a debriefing that leads to a healthy renewal. And so it's a process of looking back, like the logo on the front, of seeing how they were shaped by this recent season, how the Lord worked. And out of that, moving into their next season, which really is a preparation. I think pre-departure training is a preparation for what the Lord has for them next. And so my heart is really to equip the church, that someone in a church could come alongside that person as a returning well companion and just be able to walk with them through that process.
Mm-hmm. When you say returning, does that mean this resource is for someone who's returning forever and ever? Or could it be somebody returning for a season of home service or furlough, whatever that church or agency might call it?
Yes, that is such a great question. It is for both. And even there were people, so we had a year-long beta test that we used returning well and got responses from people all over the world. And even people transitioning from one culture of service to another culture of service were able to use it. But yes, for people who are returning for good, for people who are returning for a furlough, I would usually say that if you are coming back for a furlough, to engage it in the first 6 months. Usually there's a turning point in your home assignment that you just begin to think about that next country and you're not looking back anymore. And so kind of hitting it before that moment.
Very helpful for the context here. Let's unpack some of the elements that are common to many workers in reentry. We acknowledge everyone's situation is going to be unique, of course.
Yes.
But in generalities, what is it like for workers who are returning from a field of service?
You know, one of the things that everyone that I have worked with has experienced in varying degrees, but some in a lot of depth, is grief. And there's just so much loss in reentry. Returnees have lost the life they came to know, their friends, their team, the lady at the market that they talk to each week, their home, the cultural holidays they grew to love, their ministry role, even things internally like clarity of purpose or loss of identity or how people knew them, or even that loss of competence of coming back to their home culture, but it not being what it was. And so feeling like, wow, I'm not even competent here. So there's just a lot of grief.
Wow. It's an important word, and important that people have a chance to wrestle with a sense of loss. Well, grief being one, what else is part of their experience?
Yeah, I'd say there's probably about 3 or 4 more of them. One of them is going to be uncertainty or questions. And so the question of what is next? Do we go to another place? Do I go to another place cross-culturally? Do I stay in North America? And if people are facing that question, do I stay in North America? It's a challenge because they don't feel like they can go back to what they were doing because they've developed a greater heart for the world and they've seen things. And so they want a deeper purpose if they do stay. Other big looming questions and uncertainty is how are we going to make it financially, especially since a lot of partners drop off before they have their next thing lined up. And so even having that clarity on where do we have to go next. And so there's just uncertainty and questions. And that kind of leads to the next one, which is just exhaustion. When you put that grief and the uncertainty together, plus the fact that when you transition, you're removing all of your habits. And so every decision in your day, what time do you get up? What do you wear? Where do you find your clothes? What do you eat? How to use the coffee maker? All of that has to be relearned. And so that can just lead to a lot of tiredness and exhaustion in this season.
You know, some of this maybe went back to the second one, uncertainty and questions. It was interesting to me that some of those things, those expectations that people have would come from themselves. And some would come more externally. You mentioned, you know, partners, supporting churches.
Yeah.
There are just a whole lot of things swirling around in this season, and exhaustion is, it's understandable. The question is, how will we deal with it? So you've mentioned a few here: grief, uncertainty, exhaustion. Anything else you would add to the list?
Just a couple. Another one is just that it's humbling and disorienting. If you want to put those two together, a lot of times a returnee expects to be returning to some semblance of home, some place of cultural competence, but they come back only to realize this culture has changed. The people have changed. The place I had in their lives is now gone. And not only that, but I have changed too. And they begin to realize just how much they themselves have changed. And so there's this deep sense of homelessness of where do I belong? And it's just disorienting. And so they begin that humbling task of having to relearn what they thought they already knew. But the challenge is sometimes they don't even know what they have to relearn. And so there's one returnee, she went to the doctor and he prescribed her a medication. He did not give her a piece of paper, which she was used to. So she leaves and she calls her friend and said, what am I supposed to do? I can't go there and just tell to the pharmacy and tell them to give me this prescription. But they're not going to believe me. And she didn't know that in the time that they were gone, prescriptions began to be called in electronically. And so just those things of learning your home culture again.
Oh, yeah. Oh, boy, I remember some of this. When we came home from our experience, even on furlough from Russia and Ukraine, in those days, in the community that we lived, it was simpler than it is here. And so we became accustomed to all these things, and we walked into stores. This would have been in the early 2000s, and a huge store, bigger than any store we'd ever been in Russia or Ukraine. And there were these self-checkouts, and they're normal now.
Yes. Yep.
But you could check yourself out, and it was just like, no, we can't do that. We don't know how to do that. It was so foreign to us, and yet it was supposed to feel like home. And so disorienting.
That's exactly it.
Yeah. Now, these are some of the challenges, and I know in your list you've got some positive stuff too. What's on the positive side?
I wish the positives were more ubiquitous. The challenges seem to be more of the strain. However, but there is joy and there is rest, especially when people are finishing a season of service, when they feel like they have done what they've been called to do. If they have that solid support base in their home church and people coming around them and listening to them, if there were cross-cultural stressors that they're now relieved of, clarity on the next steps, all of those things can create a sense of rest. And so with that, a lot of returnees also choose a time of sabbatical when they return so that they can physically rest, reconnect with mentors, and really connect with the Lord to discern and to debrief, but then to discern what's next. And several also engage in continuing education as they gear up and sharpen to begin their next season. And so as a church comes around and celebrates with them and enjoys that stage with them, there is a lot of joy and rest in that time.
That's optimistic and full of hope. If we could help our churches do an even better job of receiving them home, that would be a beautiful outcome from this discussion. And I think that's the goal of every church that I've been in. The question is whether we have the understanding and the resources as well-intentioned as we are. So it's a general question, but how can churches help workers in this transition period?
Absolutely. So when a worker returns, I really see two distinct phases and different ways to interact or to engage and help in each of those stages. So the first stage is what I'd call the settling stage, and followed by the processing stage. And assuming they move through those two well, then they get to the final stage, which is the full re-engagement in their home culture.
Okay, so these are the stages: settling, processing, and then the re-engagement, the full re-engagement phase.
Right, yes.
Let's go to the first one, settling stage. What are some practical examples of how you've seen churches help in this stage?
Yeah, so just to define the settling stage, make sure that we're all on the same page. It's just when the returnee has re-entered the home culture. So this includes a lot of travel. Usually there's many expectations from churches and family and friends and supporters. And so it's a lot of travel, but then a lot of logistics. They're resetting up housing, procuring a car, changing insurance, getting a new phone. So this stage is going to take between 6 weeks to 4 months, usually, depending on different factors and their clarity on the next season. So one of the hallmarks of this stage, and I think we've alluded to it already, that really impacts how a church comes alongside, is that this is a season of a lot of mixed emotions. There's relief and grief, there's joy and sadness, and when you have all of these varied emotions, plus those 5 elements we talked about, it really can result in some challenges like atypical indecisiveness, forgetfulness, insomnia, fatigue, even mental health challenges for a time. And so just giving them an extra measure of grace during this season. They're real people under real stress. And so with that kind of heart behind it, some practical things to begin with is just having that open conversation with your attorney to say, what would be helpful for you? Even asking them, what kind of housing are you going to need? What kind of vehicle are you going to need? Can we help you find those things? Often, cross-cultural workers are overwhelmed by the number of choices in North American grocery stores or in their home, usually in their passport culture. And so even just getting a pantry wish list, do you like peas? Do you like frozen peas? Do you like peas at all? Whatever it is. Yep. And just stock their house with food items to get them through that first month or two so that that emotional challenge isn't there. But then when it is time to go to the grocery store, if they desire it, have someone who is supportive to go with them just to help them manage those sheer number of choices that they're not used to, as well as, like you said, maybe help them walk through that self-checkout for the first time and get them reacclimated to what's different that they may not have had experience with before. Also, just getting around is a challenge sometimes. If they don't have a car yet, maybe their driver's license lapsed. They didn't mean for it to, but it did. Getting items out of storage, helping them move to a new location are also some things. Another one that is significant is most cross-cultural workers, not all, but most, will leave having sold most of all their household and earthly possessions. Primarily because, at least in some places, storage is quite limited or expensive, or they thought they'd be more long-term than maybe they ended up being for various reasons. And so when they come back, just ask them, what basics do you need? Or dishes, silverware, pots, pans, bedding, things like that. And then just rally the church to provide those items just to help them kind of get set up on their feet again for that season. On a more emotional level, I would advise churches to let returnees choose when they share about their ministry with the church. I think sometimes churches can ask them to share before they've debriefed and processed it themselves. And so if they just wait when the returnee is ready to share, I think that sharing will just be so much richer, especially from a public platform. And then finally, just being sensitive to the experience of the returnee. So going back and thinking, okay, this person may be grieving because they have left the home that they loved. And even though for me, in my eyes, in my country, it doesn't feel like home and it doesn't feel like a safe place, if I say welcome home to them when they're grieving another home, sometimes that's painful and there's a little bit of a mismatch there. So even just saying things like welcome back or it's good to see you, things like that can help ease some of those more painful moments of reconnecting.
Wow, what a list. It's a starter list, but just a couple of observations there. There's the offer of doing things together. You know, you talked about accompanying people. Everybody's going to be a little different, but I remember some people, they just really appreciated, could we go together? Could we break the ice? And I'm not alone here. And you think, well, it's just a grocery store or whatever. It doesn't. It doesn't seem like such a big deal, maybe to us. But when somebody's adjusting here, having a ready place that is safe for them, that is theirs, and allowing them to build their nest the way they'd like to. So it's a bit of a balance, right? You don't want to paint it all and decorate it for them, but that it's ready and it's safe. Makes them feel anticipated, and then watching out for their kids too, where their kids are going to settle into school, and are there some relationships that can be not forced, but absolutely, but kind of seeded. I remember when we returned, there was a young family, and they came near to us. They had kids, and they just invited Kat to go out with our boys. We had 2 little boys at the time. Would you like to go swimming? And they went to the pool, and the boys just naturally started to become friends, but they felt welcomed and cared for.
What a beautiful connection. Yeah, that relationship. And also hearing you say just that openness of saying, giving them choice, but offering that as an option.
Well, that's just the first stage. This is the settling stage. The second one you talked about is processing. What are some practical ideas for local churches to come alongside during the processing stage?
Yeah, so that processing stage is when they're feeling settled and stable, at least in their living situation. And it's almost like the emotional transition begins to weigh heavy on them. And they're ready to begin kind of processing internally more. And so just relationship through listening, asking open-ended questions and acknowledging their experience, keeping the focus of the conversation on their experience. So even things like asking, who do you miss the most? What do you miss the most? It's been most difficult for you during reentry? What aspects of your culture were most life-giving? Things like that, just to open up that conversation with them and to hear their heart. we mentioned earlier, but just offering that patience, realizing that it may take them more time than expected to work through their processing. And just when you think that they should have worked through something or have an answer of what's next, they may still be right mid-process with the Lord on what he's doing in terms of really catching their heart and soul up with who they are now after this season of living cross-culturally and moving into a new cultural context. Besides that skilled listening and those empathetic conversations, just encourage and sponsor returnees to obtain an effective debriefing. They can do that in a residential debriefing program of their choice, or if they want to use Returning Well and have someone be a Returning Well companion for their congregation, that's also a good option.
Well, it's very helpful to have some particular ideas here to recommend by residential debriefing program. Just take a minute and unpack what you mean by that term.
Yes, so it's a debriefing program that you're going to travel to, usually for about a week, maybe 4 to 5 days long. You'll be in a location with other cross-cultural workers doing group debriefing and individual debriefing at a set location. And it lasts about 4 to 5 days, and that's what I meant by residential.
Just mentioned sometimes a church has the capacity to do this. Sometimes an agency has the capacity to do this. And there are pros and cons to all of these. Finding the right mix or the right solution for your workers at your church will be a thoughtful process. There are a number of programs that Melissa has mentioned and recommended. We have them in a list. We'll include those in the show notes as well, Melissa, just so you know that those programs will be mentioned there. If you think it would be really helpful for your workers to benefit from a few days of blessing that comes through discussion and encouragement and sharing by people who really care and know what they're doing, this is worthy of consideration here. Some of those are in the United States. Some are in Canada. I'm not as familiar with Europe and Asia and what is offered in those places, but certainly reach out to the mission agency as well and see what resources they have and how you can help your folks in this stage.
And you can always go to the Global Member Care Facebook group and just put a post on there saying, hey, we're looking for debriefing in this part of the world. And there's a great consortium there that's very helpful.
Excellent. Let's make sure to make that clear. The Global Member Care Facebook group, which you'll find at Facebook, of course. Great networking spot there. Right. Well, we're going to take a short break and come back with just a few final questions with Melissa. Just before we get to that part of the interview, we'd like to share with you this resource that we hope will be helpful to you and your church.
Like you, Send International longs to share the gospel with the billions alive today who have never heard that God loves them. By living among the people we long to reach, Send workers are making disciples of Christ and establishing strong, reproducing communities of committed believers in about 20 countries. We've helped hundreds of churches and mission workers engage the unreached with the life-changing message of Jesus. To explore how Send can help you engage the unreached, visit send.org today. And now, back to today's conversation.
We're back now with Melissa Chaplin, who has contributed a very important book entitled Returning Well. And we're unpacking these ideas about how a local church really can lovingly care for their workers as they return from service. I'd like to spend just a little bit right on your book, Melissa. How could a local church use this particular resource?
So Returning Well is designed to lead a returnee and a Returning Well companion of their choice through that debriefing that leads to renewal. So I define that companion as someone that the returnee trusts and who's skilled in listening well.
Okay.
So you don't have to have cross-cultural experience. It's a person who really just has that loving heart ability to listen and the trust of the returnee. And so if the returnee desires to use Returning Well, the first way a church could utilize it is to ask them who they would like to serve as their Returning Well companion, and then to try to help make that connection happen. I hear a lot of people that want a companion, but they're like, I just don't know where to go. I don't know who would be willing to do it. I feel awkward asking. And so if you can make that connection for them, that's super helpful. I would advise that the companion be someone who can keep things confidential, unless, of course, by local laws, it's not appropriate. But then also who doesn't have a say in how much that person is financially supported by the church, because that really can guard that person and hamper that debriefing. You want them to really process their experiences fully.
Excuse me. I just want to affirm what Melissa has just said. As folks are returning from the field, there is a disproportionate concern often on how finances fit into all this and support? And will they feel as free to share where they're really at if they think, oh, I'm a little bit, whatever you called it, Melissa, I'm a little bit banged up, I'm a little bit bruised. If I share that, will the church cut my support? If we can clearly delineate those two things, I think we're more likely to have authentic sharing in the process. Has that been your experience? Is that what you're speaking to as well?
Absolutely. And even if, and usually churches aren't on the agency side, but even within an agency, really encouraging people to have a confidentiality shell or a wall, essentially, that makes that place safe for them to be able to really open up and share what's really going on. I've been in those meetings where I saw them share one thing with one person, and then when behind closed doors and in a confidential space, they said, I think I'm suffering from depression. And so just to really provide that safe place where you can really give them the help that they're wanting, and not everyone is having those challenges, but just for them to be able to really find that compassion at their point of need.
Very good. I'll let you go on there.
So logistically, Returning Well is designed that a returnee would engage the questions in it over a period of one of 3 periods of time. So they get to choose that. So if they want to go through Returning Well in 6 weeks and are up for that, they can do that. They can choose 3 months or 6 months. And then Returning Well lays out 6 meetings for that returnee and the companion to have together based on their pace. So if the returnee has chosen a 6 weeks pace, those 6 meetings would be once a week. If it's 3-month pace, then those meetings are twice a month. And if a 6-month pace, then it's once a month that they would meet. And there's a chapter in the book that gives specific questions for the Returning Well companion to ask the returnee that is based on the material that the returnee engaged between sessions. And so that you're fully prepared, as long as your heart is ready and you're able to listen, you're fully prepared to step into that position and to really walk alongside them, because Returning Well will guide them through that entire process and then give you the tools as that companion to be able to join them in that process. And so in this process, it's near and dear to my heart. It's critically important. I just see so much that these cross-cultural workers have so much to offer. Their passport fellowships in terms of wisdom and experience and even cross-cultural leadership. And so this process of that effective debriefing, I've had so many people come back to me and say, I would have lost those thoughts and insights to my subconscious if I didn't go through this process. And now I'm putting them into practice in my next season of life.
So very healthy. And really, I have Melissa's book, a copy of the book, and can just affirm that this is really an equipping tool for, I would say, for a mature Christ follower with a loving heart and an ability, as you said, to be confidential, to be really caring, and listening, but to keep it safe. And it's, the questions are here. Cover this next. Here are the core topics. Here are the questions to probe, with lots of space to write in, a great resource. So here, I'll tuck it in here. Thank you, Melissa, for creating such a helpful resource.
Oh, well, thank the Lord. He's the one who did it.
Yeah.
He just used me.
Yes, right. Well spoken. Well spoken. Now, there may be other resources that you would mention as well for a missions committee, for a pastor, others listening. What are some other things that you might recommend to us?
Absolutely. For those serving as a Returning Well companion, or just simply wanting to know how to come alongside someone in reentry, I've created several webinars at the returningwell.com website under the companion section that really give practical tools and a greater understanding of that transition. And there's even one video that I interviewed someone who used Returning Well in her reentry, and it's super insightful. And then there's one specifically even on those listening skills to have. And so that one's also helpful just to think about having those conversations with people as they return. As many of you know, another resource that is highly acclaimed is the Reentry Team by Neil Pirolo. And then I would say just even simply reading some books or blogs on reentry just to become better educated as that person in that fellowship, just trying to understand the process. A few of those books could be Burn Up or Splash Down about reentry. Looming Transitions is about any type of transition. Third Culture Kids has a section on children returning and the difference that makes having grown up in a different culture. Velvet Ashes is an online community for women serving cross-culturally, and they have a returning home series, and it's super neat. You, as a returnee, you would type in your name and when you're returning, and then it sends out specifically timed emails based on your reentry. And so, as a person who is helping someone in reentry, you can put in their date of return and kind of eavesdrop in that conversation and just being able to be equipped yourself. And then Rocky Reentry is another blog committed to reentry resources as well.
We will include all of these in the show notes. Again, a few books and a few online resources that come recommended. Here I'll ask Melissa, if any of our listeners would like to follow up with you with questions, what would be the best way to reach out to you?
Certainly, I'd love to have their questions. The best way to contact me is through the Returning Well website and just click on contact.
Okay, returningwell.com. That'll also be in the show notes. Melissa, thanks so much for spending this time with us to really just open the conversation. We know it, we've barely got it going, but we've got a great resource here. Thank you for spending this time with us today.
Megs, it has been a delight and a treasure. It is such a joy to join you in this, and I do hope it is greatly helpful for the people listening.
Wow, that was a great interview, packed with helpful and practical ideas for our churches as we seek to love and support workers returning from ministry. We hope you found this discussion with Melissa to be helpful. Perhaps you would consider passing along this episode to your missions committee, or perhaps to other mission workers who may be returning from the field and could benefit from this resource. This episode has been brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International and the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of our team, thanks for listening. Join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.